Yeah, okay, so here we are, day two of this 4-day class on Introduction to Ecology. Um, and today we're going to talk about the ecology of individuals. Remember that we're organizing the class into 4 elements. The first element, which we did last week, was on the physical environment. Today's element will focus on the ecology of individuals. And then from here forward, next time we'll talk about population biology. And on the last class, we will talk about community and ecosystem ecology. The ecology of individuals really embraces 2 dimensions to ecology, physiological ecology and behavioral ecology. And so what I'm going to do today is split the class into those 2 sections. The first 45 minutes or so focusing on physiological ecology, and the second half of the class focusing on behavioral ecology. So part 1, physiological ecology, we'll start right off on that part. And we begin with just the question of what is physiology for those of you that are not biologists or not scientists. And physiology has, it doesn't have a really crisp definition, but the one that most people or many people use is physiology as a study of an organism's vital functions. And commonly in physiological ecology, those break out into 3 different bodies of interest or work. One is on energetics, the energy flow or the energy requirements of organisms, water and water balance, and thermoregulation, the regulation of body temperature. And these are all important dimensions to the distribution and abundance of species. So physiological ecology is simply the study of how these vital functions interact with environmental variation, in particular, heat or temperature on the one hand and water on the other, to influence the distribution and abundance of species. So as I just mentioned, the environmental variation is commonly about energy, energy in the form of either heat energy, that is temperature of the environment, or to some degree in behavioral ecology, the energy value, the potential energy value that's in the prey, the things that an organism consumes to make a living in this world. So before we move into this area, it will be important to define some terms which are rampant in every scientific discipline. We have concepts and terms that we have to deal with. And one of the key ones in physiological ecology is energy. What is energy? Energy is simply the capacity to do work, and that energy occurs in a diversity of forms, from the chemical energy of food, the thermal energy of the environment, to other forms of energy like electromagnetic energy, gravity, nuclear energy, and so on and so forth. And then the question of how do we measure energy? What are the units of measure? Well, everyone's heard this. For our purposes, the units of measure will be the calorie. And the calorie is nothing more than the amount of heat required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water 1 degree centigrade. There is another unit of measure of energy that is fairly widely used, especially in the technical areas of physiological ecology and energetics, and that is the joule. But we're going to focus on calories here because it's a perfectly good, simple characterization of energy that most people can relate to. So in addition, we need to talk about what we call functional relationships. Functional relationships are simply the way in which any 2 variables covary with one another or relate to one another. And these functional relationships are fundamental to physiological ecology. So one of the functional relationships that we will be talking about is heat loss as a function of body size. Bigger organisms lose heat at a higher rate, but less overall proportion of their body heat than smaller animals do. Water loss is a function of body size. Metabolic rate as a function of environmental temperature. These are some examples of functional relationships, and these particular ones are ones that we will talk about in the remainder of today's. Allama Tree. Allama Tree is a functional relationship, and it is a very particular functional relationship in the context of ecology, evolutionary biology, and physiology. And that is, Allama Tree has to do with the study of functional relationships that involve body size. All right. Why is body size important? Because it varies immensely across the array of life on Earth, from the teeniest organisms like this disease organism, mycoplasma, that's responsible for pneumonia, to a single-celled organism, Plasmodium, that causes malaria, to more complex single-celled organisms like Tetrahymena, for those of you that took an introductory biology course at some point, to larger single-celled organisms like amoeba, to something like a honeybee, which has a body mass of about 1/10 of a gram, to a hamster, which has a body mass of about 100 grams, to a human being, which has a body mass of about, on average, about 100 kilograms or 10 to the 5th grams, to the largest ever animal, the blue whale, which has a body mass in excess of 10 to the 8th grams, to the very largest known single genetic entity, which is a large stand of interconnected aspen trees. That is effectively a single organism, and those are the largest, most massive single organisms known on Earth. At least I believe they are. And that is something in the range of around 10 to the 9th grams. So we have a range of body size that spans over 20 orders of magnitude. So organisms vary tremendously in size, and that's why these body size relationships are so important. Examples of allometric relationships. I'm just going to show you some interesting examples of these allometric relationships, that is, functional relationships with organism body size for a variety of characteristics that you will be familiar with. So here is one that you'll find interesting. This is the allometric relationship of brain size to body mass in mammals, all right? And so this is actually plotted on a log scale, and I'm not going to go into why that is, so other than to say that any simple nonlinear relationship can be made linear by doing a log transformation, and that makes it much easier to see and conceptualize and work with. So all of these relationships that I show you are going to be log-log relationships, but what you can see here is the range of body size versus brain mass or brain weight in mammals, and you can see it falls on a fairly tight line with a slope of about 0.75. In other words, there's about, with every log unit of gain in mass, there's about 0.75 log units gain in mass of brain size, with body size. Keep that number 0.75 in mind because it's going to come up again. It's an interesting number. In addition to defining this relationship, it defines many allometric relationships. Here is a very similar plot for trees, and it just shows the diameter of a tree versus the mass of a tree. And you can see that these are very, again, fairly similarly related. And if you can see behind my picture there, that scaling function is, again, about 0.75. Here's another one. This will be of interest to a lot of people. This is an allometric relationship of longevity in mammals as a function of body mass. And it's not perfect, but it is actually quite good. The larger an organism is, the longer it lives. And that slope in this particular case is about 0.25. In other words, there's about 2.25 units of rise for every unit of movement on the x-axis here, or movement of run. So the slope is simply the rise over the run, and in this case, the rise over the run is about 0.25. And that defines a very broad relationship of maximum potential longevity as a function of body size. There is one organism that's not shown on this. It's an old graph, and it's a very interesting one because it has to do with bowhead whales in the Arctic. And I guess it was 10 years ago, there was a discovery made of a harpoon tip in a whale that was harvested by the Eskimos out of Barrow. And for cultural reasons, they knew that that harpoon tip was over 250 years old. And that meant that that individual whale was over 250 years old. So the very largest of living mammals are also the very oldest. Here's another allometric relationship, a little more of a population type allometric relationship. But what this shows is the relationship between the maximum density of trees in a forest and the size of the trees. And here, there's a declining relationship, as you would expect. As the trees get bigger, there can be fewer and fewer of them. And this allometric slope, this relationship, in this case is negative. The line is proceeding downward, and the scaling function is about -3/4. Here's a similar series of data for animals. And what it simply shows is the density on the y-axis of populations versus the mass of individuals, or the mass of these creatures. And this is plotted for 3 major groups of animals. The herbivores, that is the plant eaters, the omnivores, things that eat plants and animal material, and the carnivores that are exclusively meat eaters. And if you look at these data in this figure, you'll see that the carnivores lie below the omnivores, and the omnivores lie below the herbivores, but they all fall on a line that is approximately the same as it was for the trees, and that is about -0.75. In this case, the exact number is -0.77 for these data. Okay, now I'm going to move to another figure that is a famous figure from physiological ecology, and this is called the mouse to elephant curve, or the Kleiber curve. And it isn't a curve, it's a line, because again, it's plotted on a log-log scale. It's actually a curve in reality, but in log-log space, it's a line. And what this figure shows is the yellow line, which is the relationship between metabolism, heat production per day, is the way it's measured in this particular case, and the body mass or the body weight of a mammal. All right, these are all for mammals. And if that relationship were 1-to-1, if it were a perfectly 1-to-1 relationship, in other words, the mass-specific metabolic rate increased with body mass as a function of a 1-to-1 function, it would look like the yellow line there. That's what that shows. If the relationship were exactly 0.75, it would look like the black line here. And the relationship that was actually argued by Max Kleiber, who is the one that put this together way back in the 1940s, he argued that that scaling function ought to be 0.67. All right, this is before anyone was talking about 0.75. He argued that it should be 0.67. And the reason he argued that, and it made perfect sense, is that 0.67 is the relationship of mass to area. So if you have an organism that is X units of length long, its mass is going to be a square function of that, and its volume is going to be its surface area is going to be a square function of that. and its volume is going to be a cubic function of that. And Kleiber argued and inferred that heat production would be a function of volume, heat loss would be a function of surface area, and therefore this line ought to scale as a 2/3 power. That was the argument, and that's what everyone has believed for a long time. The problem is that 0.67 is very close to 0.75. In fact, so close that it's almost impossible to demonstrate statistically a significant difference between the two in any body of data. And so a new idea emerged about 15 years ago. And this new idea was fundamentally different from the Kleiber idea. The Kleiber idea is that heat loss should scale as a function of 2/3 power. And the new idea that came up, which was put forth by a physicist by the name of Jeff West and a biologist by the name of Jim Brown, who were working at the Santa Fe Institute, they argued that the power that is sacred to all of biology is what they call the quarter power, 0.5. So 0.75 is a quarter power function. It's 3 times 0.25. And so on and so forth. And their argument was that the mechanism underlying this allometric relationship is not purely surface to volume, but it is instead dictated significantly by internal transport networks. We have in our own bodies veins and arteries that are moving hot blood around, and so the movement of heat from within an organism to its environment is not just a diffusion function, as would be described by the 2/3 power, but is also a convection function. Remember, we talked about conduction and convection, and that this is actually a fractal scaling relationship that is dictated by the structure of internal transport networks, whether it be within a tree, whether it be within a mammal or a fish or a bird with a circulatory system. So this has been a point of a lot of debate and a lot of interest, a huge amount of theoretical and conceptual interest. And on the surface, it seems like such a trivial issue, the difference between 2/3 and 3/4. But fundamentally, it's very important because it has to do with very different processes. I would say that the weight of general sympathy at this point in people that work on this is the quarter power rule seems to have a lot of support. Okay, body size and environmental temperature. Body size and environmental temperature have determined a lot of ecological patterns. And so I want to spend a little time talking about some of those patterns, some examples. So here are 2 extreme body mass or body size animals, a mouse and an elephant, creatures that were made the mouse to elephant curve famous, all right? And body size has a lot to do with endurance limits, which has a lot to do with where animals live. And the reason for that is that the body fat is the energy storage tissue, and that scales with body mass. But energy expenditure or heat loss scales more with surface area. Therefore, larger animals can fast for longer periods of time than smaller animals. And so this leads to some amazing differences among species in nature. So for example, a whale can fast for 6 months. It can go for 6 months without eating while nursing a calf. And it does that all on the energy reserves that it's carrying around in the form of a huge body of adipose tissue, of fat. A little birdie like this chickadee in the wintertime when it's very cold can barely make it through a night and survive without feeding. So this bird has to feed every day, actually in about every 12 hours. If it goes longer than about 12 hours without feeding, it will lose so much body mass that it will die. Whereas this whale, in the same cold type of environment, can fast for a hugely long period of time. And this has a tremendous amount to do with where animals can live and how much they can move. So physiology becomes very important in the way in which this little chickadee can move around during the wintertime, as opposed to the way this great whale can move around over the course of its lifetime. Movement, speed versus efficiency. Animals move at different speeds. Some of them hardly move at all. Some of them are blindingly fast. And so the question is it more efficient from an energetic perspective to move fast or to move slowly? All right. Is it more efficient in terms of the energy cost, calories expended per distance, all right, to get from here to there, wherever that is that you want to go, for an animal to move slowly or rapidly? And you might just intuitively say, well, it's got to be more efficient to move slowly, right? You aren't sweating, you aren't breathing hard, your metabolic rate isn't being driven up. And for a human, that's true. It's more efficient for a human to walk than it is for a human to run. But it isn't necessarily true for all species. And so how does one address this question of efficiency? And the way that it was initially addressed, and this was work that was done by Richard Taylor, who was at Harvard University. Taylor imagined that we could create a plot in which speed of movement was put on the x-axis and the rate of energy expenditure was on the y-axis. And on that plot, if we drew a line with a slope of 1, it would be equally efficient to move quickly or slowly, all right? It wouldn't matter. Speed and the rate of energy expenditure would scale perfectly, 1 to 1, all right? But if the slope was greater than 1, then it would be more efficient to move slowly. And if the slope was less than 1, it would be more efficient to move rapidly. So it simply then became a matter of measuring the slope for different species and asking the question. And as it turns out, these are some data from Taylor's original paper. Now there's a lot more information. But as it turns out, different species have these cost of transport functions with very different slopes. So dogs, for example, have a slope of less than 1. What does that mean? That means the efficiency of movement for dogs is higher when they're running than when they're walking. This is why dogs can trot forever. They can simply trot, and it's more efficient for them to move by running than it is by walking. Well, your laboratory white mouse, which many people in our department and in the developmental and molecular biology department use as models, and many other small mammals, it's actually much more efficient for those animals to walk. And so you rarely actually see them running in nature unless they're trying to get away from a predator. So this provides a very interesting way of thinking about efficiency and locomotion. This leads to the question of what is the most efficient mode of movement? And for vertebrates, we have 3 fundamentally different media that organisms move in: the air, water, and land. So things that move in water we call swimmers, things that move in the air we call flyers, and things that move on land we call walkers or runners, and I'll call them runners for our purpose here, all right? And so it's an interesting question. Is it better to swim? Is it better to run? Or is it better to fly? Which is the more efficient mode of movement? So here is a famous graph by a early comparative physiologist by the name of Schmidt Nielsen, who was at Duke University. And Schmidt Nielsen looked at this question by simply plotting out these cost of transport functions for a bunch of organisms that were ground movers, runners, a bunch of things that fly, and a bunch of things that swim. And based on that, he concluded that it's more efficient to swim than it is to either fly or to run. It's more efficient to fly than it is to run, and moving around on land is the least efficient way to move. And this is what people thought for probably 2 or 3 decades. And then in the late 1990s, one of our own faculty members here and my dear spouse published a paper in which she debunked that idea. So this on the left is the plot from the Schmidt Nielsen graph, showing roughly the trajectories of the swimmers, the flyers, and the runners. That is the cost of transport. That is the total amount of energy used per distance moved as a function of body mass. And these are just the lines from Schmidt Nielsen's analysis. But what she recognized was that most of the runners in that study were mammals, most of the flyers were birds, and most of the swimmers are fish. And these are just fundamentally different creatures that have very different ways of metabolizing energy, of obtaining oxygen from the environment and processing that oxygen. And so the question was, if you remove that major evolutionary difference between mammals, birds, and fish from this relationship, and look at only a group that has both, which is the mammals. So there are flying mammals in the form of bats, there are swimming mammals in the form of dolphins and pinnipeds, seals and sea lions and whales and all the rest of it. And then there are a whole bunch of things that run around on the ground. And you plot those data for these different animals that use these different modes of locomotion, they fall all on exactly the same line. In other words, there's no difference at all. That flyers, swimmers, and runners are equally efficient in their cost of transport, which is kind of a cool thing to learn, to know about. And this explains probably why, or maybe one of the explanations for why so many more of the species of mammals have not become swimmers. If the cost of transport were that much more efficient to be a swimmer than a runner, if you were a mammal, then it would make sense that there would be many more of them that have evolved over time than have. The last thing I want to talk about here in this section is the way in which an organism gains heat, stays warm, or gets cold. And this is dictated by a dichotomy between what we call endothermy and ectothermy. Endothermy and ectothermy mean just what you might suppose, and that is endo meaning within. That means thermoregulation from within, generated by metabolism of the animal, versus ectothermy, which is thermoregulation or temperature change in the body from without. That means that the animal's body temperature is dictated by its environment and not by its internal metabolism. And these are really fundamentally different ways of controlling body temperature. Remember in the first class, we talked about why temperature was important, because the efficiency of process really varies as a function of temperature. So enzymes operate at higher and higher rates as temperature goes up, up, up. And so it would make sense that to perform at your maximum capacity, you would want to maintain an internal temperature that was very nearly the maximum temperature that your enzymes could handle without falling apart, all right? And that's in fact what most endotherms, or what we call warm-blooded birds and mammals, do. We have an internal body temperature of about 98 degrees Fahrenheit, and if it gets very much higher than that, we die, all right? And if it gets very much colder than that, we can't function very well. But there are a lot of creatures that don't do that at all, that they are ectotherms. Their body temperatures are dictated almost entirely by the environment that they live in, as comparing here this endothermic cat mammal with these ectothermic fish. All right. Endothermy and ectothermy has also been called homeothermy and heterothermy. They're not exactly equivalent, but endotherms tend to be constant in their body temperature, whereas ectotherms tend to be variable, thus homo versus hetero. And they've also been called warm-blooded and cold-blooded, and probably a number of other things. All right. The interesting dichotomy here is that an endotherm is going to be, by definition, is going to be a higher level performer than an ectotherm, but it's going to cost that endotherm more to do that. It's going to have to burn more energy in order to maintain that warm body temperature. So there's a trade-off between ectothermy and endothermy. Endothermic animals are high performers compared to ectothermic animals, but ectothermic animals can operate much more efficiently than endothermic animals, and they operate on a lower overall requirement for energy from their environment. I want to give you a couple of interesting examples of endothermy. We know that of course, we are endothermic, and the marine mammals are endothermic, and birds, for the most part, are endothermic. There are a few mammals that are not entirely endothermic, so bats, for example, and some sorts of other species of hibernating animals go into what we call torpor, where they allow their body temperatures to drop. They don't need as much energy when their body temperatures decline, but they also are very ineffective at being able to do anything. So the bats just hang in a cave during the wintertime and essentially do nothing, and are capable of doing almost nothing until they warm their bodies up. All right. There's a really interesting series of animals that fall in between endothermy and ectothermy, and these are the animals that we call regional endotherms, or animals that employ a strategy called regional endothermy. And this is basically a phenomenon that was discovered by Barbara Bloch, who's a professor at the Hopkins Marine Lab at Stanford. And what she recognized and discovered was that a number of fish species actually, which are ectothermic by virtue of the fact that they are fish, have what she called regional endothermy. That is, they will heat up their blood and warm up particular parts of their body selectively. And this is most important in the billfishes and the tunas. A lot of the tunas, and in particular the billfishes, have a regional endothermy where their whole body is cold, but they heat up their brain and they heat up their eyes. And they heat up their brain and they heat up their eyes because that provides them a much greater level of control in processing information and capturing prey. So it's a really cool thing that these animals do. And they have what they call heater organs. They have muscle tissues along their spine that have a high density of mitochondria in them. Those are energy producing organelles within these cells. And so the muscle's very dark, and those muscles are surrounded by a REIT system, that is a series of blood vessels that take all of the heat that's being generated by these heater tissues and shunt that hot blood to the brain and the eye. It's totally cool stuff. And it allows an animal like a tuna to be amazingly effective at being able to capture prey. Okay, so I want to end this section. Let me see what time we are at here. Sorry, I'm looking at my phone to get the time. 11:41. Okay, I've got some time. So I want to end this section because we've been talking entirely about energy, and I want to talk a little bit about water. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on water, but water is fundamentally important in physiological ecology. Water is essential to virtually all life. And so the amount of water in the environment is going to have a lot to do with the distribution and abundance of organisms. And in the case of both animals and plants, the way that they deal with water has to do with both gains and losses. All right, in order to maintain enough water in your body to function effectively, you've got to be able to get enough of it relative to the amount that you lose. And the way that animals gain water is essentially through the skin, by ingestion, which is the way that we gain most of our water. Most mammals gain water by drinking or eating, or through metabolism, through metabolic water. So the process of taking a sugar molecule and breaking it down into energy and carbon dioxide also generates water. And some animals, I'll show you an example in just a moment, get all of their water through this process by making water internally. They don't drink at all. All right. The losses, the way that organisms lose water, is evaporation through the skin. We sweat, we lose water that way. By breathing, we lose a huge amount of water at the lung surface. By respiration, so a tremendous amount of water is lost through breathing process. And the third way that we lose, or that animals lose water, is through excretion, through urination and defecation in the case of mammals. All right. And plants pretty much do the same thing. You know, they gain water, mostly in the case of plants through roots, higher plants, although other autotrophic organisms, algae and so on, don't have roots, so they take up water through other tissues. And they lose water through evaporation. And evaporation occurs largely, most of the evaporative water loss in higher plants occurs in association with photosynthesis, when the stoma, the cells that gas exchange occurs across, are open. That not only allows carbon dioxide to come into the plant and oxygen to go out, but it lets water out. And that's when plants are most vulnerable. So that's the way plants essentially osmoregulate or control their moisture. So I'm going to show one interesting figure here from a study that was done of water balance in two different desert species. One being an obligate desert species, and that's a kangaroo rat, shown here to the left. It's a very little animal, 35-gram kangaroo mouse, kangaroo rat. And the other are humans that actually live in the desert. So these are people that whose cultures, who have evolved in desert landscapes, and whose cultures have them living in deserts. And so this study was done to essentially look at how this 70-kilogram desert living human being conserved and managed water relative to this teeny little 35-gram mouse. You would expect that in a hot environment where evaporation and loss of moisture was at a premium, that this little mouse would be in big trouble. Just like insects oftentimes can't fly on hot, dry days. They just desiccate in the air before they can even land. And so you would imagine that this animal, because this large human, would be more efficient at managing water than this small mammal, but that's not the case at all. Here, what we have on the left is the sources and amounts of intake for both the kangaroo rat and the human. And so in the case of the kangaroo rat, they get about half of their water through oxidative processes. That's the burning of sugars, the metabolic process that generates water from the burning of a glucose molecule. They get none from any of the plant food that they eat, or relatively little from seeds and such. And they get, what they get from these seeds is the carbohydrates that they make water from. And they get the rest of their water from plants and insects that they feed on, and they do not drink at all. Kangaroo rats simply don't drink water. Humans, on the other hand, get a fair amount of oxidative water, a fair amount of water from the seeds and plants and various other creatures that they eat, and most of it by drinking. All right, without drinking, these creatures would die. as you well know, living in the desert. If you spend any time there, you have to have water. So they're really different. And the losses are comparably interesting. So the evaporative loss in the kangaroo rat is relatively small compared to that of the human. The loss of water in urine is extremely low. They hardly lose any water at all in urine. Their urine is almost a crystal. It's a salty, very salty material compared to the urine of a human. If a human's urine became anywhere near as salty as that of a kangaroo rat, they would long since have destroyed their kidneys. And in the feces of these kangaroo rat, feces of humans, there is moisture. As we all know, there's moisture in fecal material that humans produce, but there is no water at all in the feces of a kangaroo rat. Kangaroo rats, when they have a bowel movement, it's like a puff of dust coming out. So these creatures are very different in the way their physiologies operate that dictate where they can live. And so this gives you some glimpse into water processes and water limitation and how different species, their distribution and abundance can be very much influenced by those physiological processes. Behavioral ecology is a very diverse field. There are people that make their entire careers out of working on just little areas of behavioral ecology. I took this list of topics from a fairly well-known textbook by Nick Davies and colleagues on behavioral ecology, an introduction to behavioral ecology. And these are the chapter titles. So you can see there's a lot of stuff in behavioral ecology. I'm going to focus on just one of these, and that's the economics of consumer choice, how animals make decisions about what to feed on, all right? And I'm doing that in part because I think it's the most interesting dimension to understanding the distribution and abundance of species, the most purely ecological part of behavioral ecology, and because consumerism is such a fundamental part of life on Earth, all right? So the economics of consumer choice is built around the notion that all animals that are able to move, mobile species, which are most species, live in what we can call a patchy environment. That is an environment that's not homogeneous. It varies in terms of a lot of things, but in particular in terms of the availability of food. And so with regard to the availability of food, this leads to two questions. How should an animal move from patch to patch to patch optimally? And what to eat when you are in a particular place. So imagine that you're a humpback whale out here in Monterey Bay, where I'm staring right at the moment, and you are feeding on schools of anchovies. And those schools of anchovies are very patchy. There will be a dense ball of anchovies, and it may be a mile or half a mile or a few hundred yards or on the seafloor or on the surface for another patch. And so they have to know how to move from patch to patch. And then for most species, when they are in a particular place to feed, what we call a patch, there are choices to be made about what to eat. And so the question is, how do you move from patch to patch? And how do you make decisions on what to eat and what not to eat? That's the question. Those are the questions that we're dealing with here. Okay. So to answer these questions, we make an assumption, and it's a very fundamental assumption across all of ecology and evolutionary biology and much of biology in general, and that is to assume that natural selection favors an optimal behavior. In this case, it favors efficient foragers, or the most efficient forager. So what does it mean to be an efficient forager? Generally, that is thought of in two ways. An animal can become an efficient forager by seeking to maximize its energy intake, and those animals are called energy maximizers, or it may seek to minimize the time spent foraging, and those are called time minimizers. Why would an animal minimize the time spent foraging? it may simply have to do a lot of other things that have a high premium, like avoid being eaten itself, and so on and so forth. But most of the theory that has been built in foraging ecology has been built initially on this notion of energy maximization. So that's what I'm going to tell you mostly about today. All right, and there's a little bit of a history and a nuance of philosophy involved here. Much of this has to do with the view that has been prevalent in ecology for a half a century or longer, really since the very beginning of the discipline, that the distribution and abundance of species was influenced more by the things that a species consumes than it was by things that consume that species. All right, and so because that view of nature has been so long prevalent in ecology, this notion of energy maximization has become the focus of people's thinking. Maximizing energy. How does one maximize energy if you're a consumer? Well, imagine a prey, something that you are going to eat as this consumer. And there are three essential characteristics of that particular prey. One is that it has an associated value of energy. A candy bar has 10 calories. A mouse may have 15 calories to the things that eat it versus some larger prey, maybe many more. All right, so E, which is the value of the associated energy, is one critical dimension to the characteristic of the prey. The second one is the amount of time that it takes the predator or the consumer to find that prey. It's called a search time. And it takes a while to look around to nature and find whatever it is you're trying to eat. And then the third key part of this is what we call a handling time. And that is, once a prey has been found in this process of searching, it takes some time for the consumer to either subdue it or to process it to get it into its mouth and into its system, all right? And that's called the handling time. So there are these three elements. We're going to move into something that's a little bit mathematical now, but there are these three elements: energy, search time, handling time. And the goal of an energy maximizer is simply to maximize the value of E divided by S plus H. E is the amount of energy that comes in. S plus H is the amount of time it takes to get that energy. And this is called the net rate of energy gain. And it's sometimes referred to as just EN in the parlance of foraging ecology and the economics of consumer choice, all right? So the amount of energy divided by the amount of time it takes to find the prey versus plus the amount of time it takes to subdue and consume that prey once it's been found defines this value, the net rate of energy gain. And the goal conceptually is to maximize the net rate of energy gain. So how does one do this? Circle back to what I said right at the beginning. By making the right decisions on what to eat and where and how long to look for food, all right? How to move around from patch to patch, and once you are in a patch, what to eat. Those are the decisions that one wants to make. And so we're going to talk about how we conceptualize those things and what we know about how consumers make those choices. So here's a really cool graph, all right? And what this graph shows is simply the net rate of energy gain by this consumer, which is a crab, all right? It's a green crab, and that green crab eats mussels, all right? And this is a lab study where the people that did this work simply took mussels of different sizes, from little bitty mussels to bigger ones to bigger ones to the very biggest mussels, and they measured the net rate of energy gain for these crabs, or to these crabs, for each of these different prey. And in this particular case, the teeniest little mussels provided relatively little net rate of energy gain. The bigger the mussels got, the more the net rate of energy gain increased, up to a point. And at this point, it started to go down. And the reason it started to go down is because the muscles become bigger and better defended against the predator. And so it takes more and more handling time to deal with these things. And so that handling time goes up and the net rate of energy gain goes down. And we have this relationship that looks like this. All right, it's a hump-shaped relationship. And these middle-sized muscles provide the highest net rate of energy gain. Now, in this study, what the people that did the work did was that they gave the crabs an array of different prey sizes when all of the prey were abundant and when all of the prey were relatively scarce. And they looked at the size distribution of the composition of the diet of the crabs when prey were abundant versus when they were scarce. And lo and behold, what they found was that they ate mostly the optimal size. They did not eat any of the very small ones or the very big ones when prey was abundant, but they did eat them in higher proportion when prey was scarce. So this led to a question, really, not this work so much, but this general view of how an organism makes a decision when it's out in the world foraging of whether to stop and eat this mussel if it finds it or not. Now, intuitively, if you're a crab and you're hunting mussels and you find one of these, the mid-sized mussels, that's the best you can ever do. So you should stop and eat it no matter what, all right? But that isn't necessarily going to be the case for these smaller mussels. It may be that stopping and eating one of these smaller mussels is going to cost you because it's going to remove time that you might have otherwise spent searching for these more optimally sized mussels, and thus you might actually reduce your net rate of energy gain by stopping and eating this one or one of these other suboptimally sized mussels. So there's a theory that was developed to try to understand how these decisions were made. All right, this was a mathematical theory, and it was created by Eric Chernov, who was at the University of New Mexico. And it's a really simple theory, and I'm just going to go through Chernov's logic, which doesn't require any mathematics other than just knowing what algebra and relationships of that sort. All right. So remember that there are three elements to measuring the net rate of energy gain. There's the energy value of the prey, there's the search time of finding the prey, and there is the handling time once that prey has been found. And so Chernov said, imagine a system with just two prey types, prey type 1 and prey type 2. And prey type 1 has an energy value of E1, and prey type 2 has an energy value of E2, and prey type 1 has a handling time of by the consumer of H1, and prey type 2 has a handling time of H2. And he imagined that these species were such that E1 divided by H1, that is the energy value divided by the handling time of prey type 1, was higher than the energy value divided by the handling time of prey type 2. All right. Given that, the consumer should always eat prey type 1 because it has a higher rate of energy consumption. Once it finds a prey type 1, it should always eat it because the return of energy per time spent handling is the greatest for that prey. But it should also eat, this is just his logic, it should also eat prey type 2 if the energy value of prey type 2 divided by the handling time of prey type 2 is greater than the energy of prey type 1 divided by the handling time of prey type 1 plus the search time. So as the search time for prey type 1 becomes greater and greater, this value of energy return per time is going to become less and less. And so when an animal comes upon a prey type 2, it should always eat that prey type 2 if E2 over H2 is greater than the energy return given the amount of search time it's going to be required to find another prey type 1. All right. So when prey type 1 becomes rarer and rarer in the environment, this value becomes smaller and smaller. And so logically, that means that one ought to be more inclined to feed on prey type 2. So if we take this relationship, this simple relationship, and simply rearrange terms, just algebra, we come up with the conclusion that prey type 2 should only be consumed if the search time for prey type 1 is greater than this relationship. So you've actually got a relationship now in things you can measure. You can measure the energy content, you can measure the handling time, and you can measure the search time or the relative abundance of these species. And that gives us a means of deciding, of making an inference about whether this consumer should just eat one species or whether it should eat them both in this simple two-species system, right? So that's the theory. And it's a very elegant theory, but it was not tested. And so the test of the theory, which is also very interesting and really elegant, was done. Well, first of all, let me just reflect on some of the predictions. And I'm only going to give you two of the predictions of this relationship. That is, first prediction is the decision on whether to specialize only on prey type 1 or to generalize on both prey type 1 and prey type 2 has nothing to do with the abundance of prey type 2. You don't see anything in here on the abundance of prey type 2, which would be reflected in S2, the search time, okay? So it's independent of how many prey type 2s there are and only dependent on how many prey type 1s there are, all right? And the second prediction is that the switch between specializing on just prey type 1 and generalizing so that you consume prey type 1 and prey type 2 should occur instantly, and it should be absolute. That is to say that the organism should always either just specialize or always generalize when it comes into contact with a prey type 2. And that prediction is built on this inequality. So that's sort of a complicated relationship, and how might one go about evaluating whether it's true or not? Because oftentimes theory looks great, but sometimes there are other dimensions to the way systems work that make reality somewhat different. So this was resolved initially in a famous body of work that was done by a British behavioral ecologist, John Krebs. Krebs is at Oxford, still there. And what Krebs did was said, let's test Chernov's theory in the laboratory with a real predator confronted with very different kinds of prey availability. And the predator that he used, the consumer he used, was a bird that's common in Britain, the great tit. Here's a picture of it. So they had a bunch of these things in the lab that they trained to feed. And they put them in this little feeding apparatus. And that feeding apparatus was a cage, all right? And the cage had a little opening at the bottom and a perch. And beneath the opening at the bottom, there was like a treadmill that would move at a constant speed around and around and around. And the experimenters would stand out of the sight of the bird over here, and they would add food to this belt that would move along, and they could add food in different types and in different abundances to simulate an environment in which prey type 1 and prey type 2 were varied in relative abundance to one another. And to make prey type 1 and prey type 2, they simply used mealworms. And prey type 1 was a full mealworm, and a prey type 2 was a half a mealworm. And so they would sit here and they could put whole mealworms on this sliding drum at different rates, which would simulate different availabilities in nature mixed with different abundances of the smaller mealworm. And they could then determine, does this tit, this great tit, feeding, under what circumstances, does it eat both? versus under what circumstances does it eat only one or the other. And so that's pretty cool. A very interesting way to approach the problem. And here are the results from one of their replicates, all right? So this is the value. Again, this is, I just changed the form a little bit here. This is the inequality. And here are the ranges in the inequality on the x-axis. And here are the behaviors of the bird on the y-axis. And these behaviors simply range from always specializing, the percentage that always specializing 100%, to never specializing 0%. And so what you can see is that as they change the abundance of the worms, what they got was a species that was almost entirely generalized, and then at a point, it made a very sharp transition. This solid line is the theoretical prediction of exactly how that ought to work, and the dashed line is the observed data for this one particular bird in one particular trial. So what would one conclude from that? One would conclude that the fit isn't perfect, but it's very much different than you would expect if there wasn't some truth to Chernov's theory. That is, there's a fairly abrupt transition point where these birds go from being largely generalists to almost entirely specialists. So there you've got some theory and some observation and some ammunition to think about under what circumstances should an organism eat different things. So the general prediction from this theory is that dietary diversity should increase as food resources, and in particular the resources that are most valuable, become less abundant. Okay? So what's the evidence for that from nature? Well, there's lots of it, but I'm going to just tell you one little story that comes from our own work because it involves sea otters, and it's an interesting behavioral ecological story. So here's a map of California, which you'll all recognize. And there are two areas shown in red circles or ellipses on this slide. One of them at the top shows the range of the current California sea otter population in Central California, or at least at the time this work was done. And the one at the bottom shows San Nicolas Island. And the reason these are interesting places is that otters have lived along the central coast of California for decades, and their populations are thought to be limited by food availability. And San Nicolas Island is a place where otters had occurred at high densities, but they were eliminated during the fur trade. And then a few years ago, a few animals were taken from Central California and moved to San Nicolas Island in this superfood-rich environment. And so comparing the behavior, the foraging behavior of the animals in Central California with the animals at San Nicolas Island became very interesting. So this is just a figure to show you two things. One is the relative abundance of two of the dominant prey items in Central California compared with San Nicolas Island. And this is on a log scale. So this shows these are tremendously different values. And the SN simply means snails, which otters eat, marine snails, and UR means urchins. And otters eat a lot of snails and urchins, all right? So that's the abundance of snails and urchins in Central California, quite rare compared to San Nicolas Island, where they're vastly more abundant. And this bottom figure simply shows the food intake in terms of the grams of prey per time, comparing Central California with San Nicolas Island. And so you can see that the animals at San Nicolas Island are getting a lot more food per time spent foraging than the animals in Central California are. So this is a great contrast to ask the question, do the principles of diet specialization and generalization more or less follow in this contrast of diet between Central California and San Nicolas Island? And they do. So here is the diet of the otters at Central California, and along the base of this graph on the x-axis are just a bunch of letters that refer to different species, different prey species. So UR is urchins and KC is kelp crabs and so on and so forth. And it doesn't really matter what these are for your purposes. And here is a comparable plot of the proportion composition of the diet of the otters at San Nicolas Island. And what do you see? You see a more diverse diet by far in Central California than you do at San Nicolas Island. So on the surface, that would seem to support the theory. The problem is, one of the problems is with this inference is that these are not individual data. These are data from the population of animals in Central California and data from the population of animals at San Nicolas Island. They don't show us the diets of individuals. So the question then became, does the diet of individuals map onto, more or less, these diets of the population? So the assumption, if that's true, is that the diet and foraging behavior of all individuals are more or less the same. Is that true? Is that true? Well, you know where I'm going with this, because I wouldn't even ask the question if it were true. The answer is, it's not true. So here are some plots. And these are the ones I just showed you. These are the population level dietary data of otters in Central California versus San Nicolas Island, a more diverse diet in California than at San Nicolas, Central California than at San Nicolas. And here are the diets of individuals. And we knew these individuals because they were marked. And so we could identify them when we were observing them feed in nature. And so if you look at the individuals from San Nicolas Island, they're pretty much all the same. A little different, but pretty much all the same. Like I said, a little different here and there, but consistent compared with the individuals from Central California, which are vastly different from one another. In fact, in many instances, there was virtually no similarity at all between the diets of these different individuals, despite the fact that these data were gathered from the same places and the same times. So in other words, this is not explainable by animals feeding at different places and different times, nor could this be confounded by animals feeding in different places at different times, right? So this was stunning, because what it told us is in these food limited environments, in fact, there's a huge amount of individuality, and that this variation that people have seen in the behavior of individual feeding relative to the abundance of food was more, in this particular case, an effect of individuals becoming specialists on particular prey types, and that the diversity in the population was really the diversity among those specialists, whereas you didn't see that at all at San Nicolas Island. They were all doing basically the same thing. So that was a pretty cool finding, and it's interesting, I think, as a point of natural history, and also as a lesson for how one can become swept up in a theoretical prediction and misinterpret data if one doesn't look more carefully at some of the alternative explanations. So that's more or less a lesson about science and a lesson about inference, but with clear implications and application to this issue of foraging behavior. So that's what I'm going to tell you about what to eat when you're in a patch. It's a complicated world. There's some really interesting theory about it. There have been some interesting experimental tests of that theory, and there have been a lot of field studies done, and I've given you a small flavor of one of the ones that my lab was involved with over the years. Now I'm going to move to patch selection. This will be the second part. Let me see how much time I have. So yeah, I've got about another 15, 20 minutes or a little longer here. So we'll move into the patch selection, and then we'll have some discussion afterwards for those of you that are interested and want to hang on for that. So again, patch selection, what's it about? It is based on the notion that in nature, that food tends to be patchily distributed, and a consumer is going to move from patch to patch to patch. And the challenge is, for a consumer, how long to stay in that patch to maximize the net rate of energy gain. If you stay too long, you're going to eat everything that's there. If you don't stay long enough, you're going to waste all your time looking for another patch. So there's an optimum of how long to stay. And that seems like a very tough problem to solve. But it's not actually too tough a problem. And here's the way the problem was resolved. Again, it's an approach based purely on theory. And here's the theory. Imagine that you are an animal that enters a patch, and you enter the patch through time right here. You can see my cursor at the bottom. The rate of energy gain is going to be highest right at that point because all of the prey will still be there. The consumer will not have removed any of them. But as the consumer stays in the patch longer and longer and longer, it's going to deplete more and more and more of those prey. So the total amount of energy gain is going to continue to rise, but is going to do so at an increasingly lower rate. All right. It's going to get less and less and less return for its effort as time goes on. All right. So this is called a load function. This basically characterizes the rate at which this animal will be able to extract food from that patch through time because of the fact that it's going to be depleting the patch. That's the theory. All right. So the question is, where, once you enter the patch as a consumer, when do you move on to another one? All right. And it's a really elegant solution to how this was determined. All right. It's a very simple graphical solution to the way this was determined. All right. And it was determined in this way. So if we look back at our figure, this point on the x-axis right here where my cursor is circling is the point at which the patch is discovered. All right. And then all of the rest of the time from that point to the right is time spent in the patch. And we want to know when to quit, when to leave, when to go to somewhere else to have a better meal. And the time axis to the left is search time. All right. This is the time that the animal is traveling around looking for a patch to feed in. All right. And it turns out that the place, the proper place to leave the patch really depends on how far apart these patches are, what the travel time is from wherever you might be to finding another patch. So the optimal strategy, how long to remain in the patch so as to maximize the rate of energy gain, is the question here. So we can characterize, here's a figure that shows this. This actually came off of Wikipedia, I think. You can go and read about these things if you want to learn a little bit more about them. But keep in mind that in this graph, we have two dimensions. The y-axis dimension, which is the energy gain, and the x-axis dimension, which is the time it takes to gain that energy. So the question is, should you stop here and go somewhere else? Should you stop here and go somewhere else? Or should you stop here and go somewhere else? And the answer to that question results from what is called the marginal value theorem. And that is simply to say that if you take a line and you start it at the beginning of the search time and you run it up to the point where it just touches the gain curve, that is, it becomes tangent to the gain curve, that is going to define a line that has the highest slope. And that slope is a measure of the rate of energy gain. And so that point is going to give you the highest rate. This is the point that you should leave to go somewhere else. If you leave here, you will have left too soon. If you leave here, you will have left too late. Under both these circumstances, your rate of energy gain, which is measured by the slope of this line, is going to be less than this optimal, which is the marginal value, that is the tangent. All right. So that's the theory about how to figure out when to pick up and leave. All right. So this theory can be used to answer all kinds of interesting questions. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about a case study right at the end. All right. So it can be used to answer really interesting questions like, how does load or giving up vary with increased prey abundance? All right, so if we look at a system where the prey is more abundant in the patch than another system where it is less abundant, these load curves are going to be characterized by the red, which is the less abundant prey, and the green, which is the more abundant prey. And if we use the marginal value theorem under these two different circumstances to figure out the optimal giving up point, what we see is that it pays to stay longer in a patch that has less food. That is not intuitive, but your overall net rate of energy gain, if you're living in a world where the prey patches are very rich, it pays off to stay a relatively short period of time and go elsewhere. If you're living in a world where the prey abundance is relatively low, it pays to spend longer time there before moving on to another spot. So these are some kind of intuitive understandings that can come from this general approach to how an animal ought to behave in nature. Oops, sorry. There is another dimension to the reality of life, and that is that the only benefits that you get from spending time feeding are not energy gain. There is a cost, and that cost is a cost of being eaten yourself. So if you're out running around looking for food, typically going to be in a more vulnerable situation than if you're hiding somewhere and not feeding, all right? And this results in a whole other dimension to foraging ecology, which is called the ecology of fear. The ecology of fear was created by Joel Brown at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And Brown basically recognized that not only is energy maximization important, but survival is important in terms of avoiding being eaten. And that ecology of fear creates a counterpoint around which animals should adjust their behavior to increase their fitness, to increase their survival and reproduction optimally. It's not just based on food availability. So this ecology of fear has become a whole new dimension to behavioral ecology in probably the last 30 or 40 years. So I've run through physiological ecology and behavioral ecology superficially and very rapidly. I want to just hit the high points of these two areas, and then we can circle back on some questions. So physiological ecology, I pointed out that it is mostly about temperature and energy. We talked about functional relationships. We talked about Allama Tree, functional relationships involving the body size of animals and scaling constants in Allama Tree. We talked a little bit about endurance limits. We talked a little bit about the cost of transport and the differing or similar costs of transport as a function of body size and different modes of mobility in nature. Talked very briefly about ectothermy and endothermy, cold-bloodedness, warm-bloodedness, heterothermy, homeothermy. And we talked a little bit about water balance and about how the physiology of water balance is so important to the distribution and abundance of species. And then moving to behavioral ecology and the high points, we talked about, first of all, the diverse dimensions to the field of behavioral ecology. We then moved to the economics of consumer choice and focused entirely on that one dimension to behavioral ecology. We talked a little bit about the theory of prey selection, Chernov's theory of prey selection and when to consume a species and when to leave it and go for something else. We talked about Krebs' classic study with the great tits, testing this theory. And then we talked a little bit about individuality and the importance of individuality in dictating what the diet of a species might look like in a particular circumstance. And then we talked at the end about the theory of patch selection, the marginal value theorem, and we ended with a brief discussion of the ecology of fear. So that's it for today. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to unmute your microphones, and I will come up and we can talk for anyone that might have any interest in further discussions or questions or whatever. Let's do that now. Okay. Questions?
I have a question, which is a general question about ecology in general. And I'm assuming that you and I and most of the people in this class are old enough to remember the very first ecology day, April 22nd, 1970, which is exactly, well, plus a few days, 50 years ago. I was there organizing that event with the Berkeley Ecology Center. So it made quite an impression on me. And we felt then that we were bringing ecology to the masses, and it was a new word. Many people had never heard of it. And now, 50 years later, what, in your opinion, is the role of ecology? Has it increased in this country, the recognition of it and its importance, or whatever your opinion is?
Yeah, well, that's a big question, isn't it? I have an opinion, like I do on most things. And my opinion on that particular issue, well, I was there too, but not in Berkeley. I was actually a master's student at Washington State University for that first Ecology Day or Earth Day in 1970. There's certainly an awareness, prior to that time and thinking back before the 1970s into the 60s and 50s, relatively little awareness of the relevance of ecology to human welfare, sustainability of life, and all of that sort of thing. There were a few people that were talking about it. Really, the first significant entity that really kind of dragged people into that arena and became a point of broad public discussion was Paul Ehrlich's book, Population Bomb, which was very controversial. It was thought by many people to be excessively pessimistic. Paul's still living. In fact, yeah, he's still living. In fact, he was teaching at Stanford. He's in his late 80s now, still teaching until a year or two ago. I think we have certainly an awareness. We have an awareness of climate change. We not only are aware of the existence of our intimate relationship with nature, but of the perils of some of those relationships, of food depletion, of pollution, of climate change, which is probably the biggest of them, of pandemics. Here we are. So we're aware of those things. How much has that influenced our behavior? In my opinion, almost not at all. I hate to say that, but that's just my view. I think what we have come to understand, at least I have come to believe, let's not say we have come to understand, I have come to believe that the most powerful force in today's world in influencing human behavior is economics and money. And that is really sort of, pardon the pun, kind of trumps everything. So that's my view. But, here we are. It's just this morning, it's interesting to think about where we stand in our concerns over economic return on the one side and our desire to live in a world where we have enough coming in to sustain ourselves and to become wealthy or whatever our goals are. And on the other side, to avoid dying from a disease, all right? So we have this pandemic now that's sweeping the world, which is not highly dangerous from an individual perspective. Your chances of dying from COVID-19 as an individual are quite small relative to everything else that could kill you, especially at the age that we most of us are. Nonetheless, it is a terrifying prospect, and people are scared to death, and they are influenced by that fear. Even so, it's so interesting to me to have watched the last month or two, maybe even the last few weeks, about the things that really have come to dominate human behavior. And it isn't so much the fear of the disease. People are more or less moving on and saying, at least this is my opinion, I'm going to risk it because I simply can't live without working or without getting out in the world and so on and so forth.
Right.
So so it gets back to the question, because I see the disease as being an epiphenomenon of the way we have treated animals and the way that we've lived, worked in nature. And it's an epiphenomenon of high population density, and it's an epiphenomenon of the way that we have interacted with animal species, which is part of the environmental problem. And so where will it all come out? Who knows? But I get back to your question. I think a lot of people are very heartened by where they see ecology and environmentalism going. I see a lot of awareness, but I see very little in the way of effective action to deal with the real serious problems that we have of things like disease and climate change and food security and that sort of thing. So that's my, unfortunately, sort of fairly pessimistic view of it all. You asked the question, you got the answer.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah.
It is a wonderful question, yeah. And one I wish you hadn't asked, because now you probably won't come back.
I don't think so.
Okay, I have to ask one then, Jim. The study you did on the otters, how in the world did you actually do this field study of knowing what they were eating and individual otters, and how long did you have to study how many otters, etc.?
It took some effort, but it was actually not that difficult to do because otters are really easy to watch. So any of you that have been out on the shoreline have seen them, and you can sit there and watch them, and with the right equipment, a good spotting scope and some practice, you can identify what they're eating with a high level of accuracy. So we simply captured animals, marked them, and spent time out in the field documenting what they were feeding on. I got onto the idea of individuality about 30 years ago. And it really wasn't because I had any direct evidence for individuality, but the statistical data really started to suggest to me that there was individual variation. And so once I kind of got onto that idea, we started looking more carefully at the individual diets. And really, it was simply a matter of developing longitudinal records for individually marked animals through field studies. I suppose all of that work that went into that particular study probably took about a decade. So I had students working in the field. We have technicians working in the field. We instituted this study, and like most of these things, they are time and labor and money intensive. And so, it took a bit of effort to do all that, but it was not challenging otherwise. It was simply, the people that do this work, myself included, you like being out there watching otters and recording what they're feeding. And then you like coming back into the lab and taking all the data and analyzing them and looking for patterns and asking what are the next questions and what should we do. So, that's the stimulation for doing it. And there's some hard times like raining and cold and blowing, and a tag falls off, or you aren't sure about something, and all that sort of thing. But I think for the most part, it was time consuming, but certainly not tedious. So I have a question for you folks, because I know there's sort of an array of people. I don't know how many are here today. Looks like we've got, I'm not sure. But my question is, it's hard to know how to teach an ecology course at this level. I know pretty much what I want to do when I teach undergraduates, because I know what they need to know, and I know what they're expected to know coming in. And so I'm trying to make this something more rigorous than just some stories
Yeah,
about nature.
right.
So my question to you is it comprehensible to those of you that aren't trained scientists? There's some math and there's some logic and explanations and so on. I need to know that, especially going on from here. I haven't put together the last two lectures, but this is sort of the nature of what this branch of science is. And so any feedback that you might have there, and if you don't want to say it, you can send me an email. But I would appreciate that, because that's probably the thing that I've struggled with the most in doing this class, is just at what level do I try to shoot for in presenting information, given the limited amount of time that we have, which is just four class sessions of a couple of hours each. So you needn't answer it necessarily unless you want to, but but I would like some of that, because it would help me a lot going forward. Like if you write me and say, look, I just got nothing from any of this stuff that you're putting up there, or not enough to, it's just absolutely useless to me, then I need to hear that. If it's like, I struggle, but
You don't need to take the class.
Okay, you've got a few hands up. Let's see.
Okay.
Did
Oh,
you-
good. All right. Well, yeah, they're all popping up. I see there are a few here. So why don't we, Barry, do you want to orchestrate that, or?
Janice?
Hi, yeah, well, I'm very, very happy with the information that you're providing. And I don't expect to be able to turn around to someone and describe what you've just said in the lecture. But what I am able to do is, for example, from last week, I'll be able to more clearly or with more insight understand weather reports that are broadcast, for example. Because of the patterns of the airflows and the what happens at the equator and so forth, and today and precipitation, I'll be able to understand more what that implies. And in regard to today, I mean, I'll just be able to understand more when there are discussions about species who are endangered, perhaps, or food sources that are no longer available. And it also applies to just a greater sort of general understanding. And I was thinking about humans a lot as you described these animals, large and small. So I'm very happy, and I'll be back next week.
Good. All right. Well, thank you for that.
Jim, so Garrett asked, do plants and sessile animals have their own ecological rules?
As opposed to mobile animals? Is that the question? Well, the one big difference between a sessile organism and a mobile organism is that the sessile organism can't search for food. It can basically either eat or not eat what comes by. And so, yes, almost all of what I was talking about applies to mobile creatures, which most animals are mobile, most plants are not. So plants and animals are fairly fundamentally different in that one dimension to their behavior. Plants do move around, but not in ecological time. They move around in kind of life history time. So they disperse seeds and pollen and that sort of thing. But they are stuck at one place. Once they put their roots down, that's where they are until they die. So yeah, and there really hasn't been very much interest in foraging in sessile, especially plants. There has been, you'd be surprised, there's been quite a bit of work on how different environments, carbon density, for example, and things of that sort, influence plants, and how plants can behave. They actually do behave in interesting ways. Plants have, so for instance, plants alter the orientation of their leaves to the sun, depending upon whether they need radiation or whether they want to avoid desiccation, that sort of thing. There's been a lot of that sort of thing, but there really has been very little corpus of sort of conceptual work on feeding ecology in plants. There's been a huge amount of work on the environmental physiology of plants, because they basically are subject to a lot of the same sorts of things. Movement is not an important part of that dimension of their existence, whereas movement is really an important part of foraging. That didn't answer your question, I'm afraid, but that's as close as I can get.
There was a question about emailing you. So your email address is jestes at ucsc.edu.
Yep. Yeah. And if you can't remember it, you can probably just Google me and it'll come up. So yeah, jestes@ucsc.edu. Just one word, Jestes.
Lois?
I want to say something answering your question. I think there are maybe more people here than there were last week. But the way you answer that question is, how many of us come back to the patch? How many of us are here? You know,
Well,
we go go see other patches or whatever, but in some ways, I think that answers your question. That
the theory,
I'm finding.
the theory would predict that if you're coming back to the patch, it's because the patch is not being depleted, and so maybe you feel that there's still an abundance of resource there for you. That's why I would predict that you would come back. It could also be a very low quality resource, like incomprehensible information. That's a good reason to move on.
Gunther.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. For me, that's very interesting because I never really was introduced to your field of expertise before. So very interesting to me. And I was thinking about how does it apply to human beings? The formula E divided by S plus T. And today, when you look at food, there is no search time for human beings, at least for us. And there's no handling time. You can eat immediately. And I can see, therefore, the restaurants are so popular, So you don't spend any energy going to a restaurant. You have everything there. But it has a point. I mean, if it's so easy
That's not true.
to abuse, we have obesity. We get fat. We don't spend enough energy. So that reduces our life expectancy, I would think. And
Yeah. No, I think you're right on the money. I mean, that's
and what you said, it's economics and money. Economics and money. That is maybe why our species are doomed. We have no search time. We have no handling time. And our species must decline over future time unless, even if economics and money rules, because economics and money applies to a smaller and smaller portion of the people, the 1%ers and maybe a little bit more. So I thought that was interesting. That explains to me a little bit why I love to go to Gales here in Capitola all the time, because that's the easiest way for me.
Yeah, I think I think about my behavior and other people's behavior very much in the context of some of this stuff too, and the consequences to people. I mean, it is true that there's almost no differential cost of feeding anymore for humans. We have almost no time that's demanded. The only thing that it's limiting is the amount of time to get to some place. But food limitation in this country for most people is not a critical dimension to our fitness.
Right.
Marjorie, you had a question?
Yes. With humans, if handling includes cooking, a lot of energy can be spent.
Sure. I mean, you can put a lot of this stuff into that same sort of general model. And I think Chernov's model was elegant. It really was. It was kind of a whole new way of thinking about why animals should feed the way they do. And before he came along, and he was doing this when I was still young and before I even got into the field, but the thought was that people pretty much just, or that a consumer would just take whatever was available to it, and that there weren't any real rules of consumer choice. And I think the interfacing of sort of an economic mindset with the rules of consumption became very important. Sort of the whole notion of costs and benefits, and the costs being time and the currency of benefits being energy. It could be something else, because it isn't always just energy that is limiting, but the calorie has become fairly sacred in the way we think about ecology, and it's sacred in the way we eat. There are calories that are pasted on everything that we consume, because one, we're worried about getting enough energy on the one hand, and more on the other, we're worried about getting too much energy, becoming obese, and having all these various other problems. So the calorie is still very, very sacred unit of measurement. And so a lot of these notions, I think, apply to human foraging behavior. But they also apply to other dimensions to human behavior. So there was I didn't talk about this study, but there's a very interesting study done on the marginal value theorem that was done with apple pickers. And so picking apples is very much like depleting a patch. There's a picker that's in a tree, and how long do you continue to pick apples before you move to another tree?
Uh-huh.
And so if you stay too long, there won't be any apples left, and there's no point in staying. And if you stay a little too long, there are not going to be very many. On the other hand, if you just pick a couple that are right there, the low-hanging fruit, and then move to another tree, you waste all your time moving from tree to tree. And so they were really interested in the dynamics of that behavior amongst pickers. And the cool thing about the study was that they used orchards where the spacing of the trees was different from one another. And in fact, it absolutely mapped exactly onto what theory would predict. As trees became further and further apart, people's giving up times, the time at which they left the tree, became longer and longer. No big surprise, I suppose.
Sandy, did you have a question?
Hi, yeah. I have a couple of questions. One, I wondered if you could comment a little bit on Barry Commoner. You mentioned Paul Ehrlich, but I'd like to know what you have to say about Barry Commoner as well. And also, I'm wondering about the body temperature of the human, and what it means if it's a lower body temperature in a normal state, and what they're using in medical events to prolong life or correct issues like heart and so forth, where they put the person into a much lower body temperature. Thank you.
You're forcing me into some arenas that I'm not really very knowledgeable about, especially the medical side of it. I do know Barry Commoner, knew of him. He was he was a very sort of outspoken advocate of the need for certain sorts of environmental behavior. Barry Commoner, I think, actually ran for president or tried to run for president at one point. He was in about that same era, probably somewhat more politically militant than Paul was. Paul was an intellectual, and most of his stuff was just through his writings. Commoner was much more deeply involved in human behavior and policy and politics and all of that. And that was a long time ago. That was when I was young. So, I don't know how much longer he was influential, but that was during the 70s, really, late 60s and 70s that I remember that. And I remember Commoner, I don't remember where this ended, but I remember Commoner being, fairly prominent figure on the political landscape and discussions of what was needed. And I think Commoner's view was that we needed somebody that was looking toward sustainability, toward a sustainable world, to lead the country forward. And that idea has just never, ever resonated with people as a reality. It simply never has. It has never been, at least in my view, it has never been a significant dimension to almost any political decision or voting that's taken place. People have not come to grips with it. I don't know how many of you remember or knew Michael Soule, but Michael was the chairman of environmental studies here for a number of years. I mentioned his name because he's on the verge of death right now. He's just, he's got another day or so left, and he and I were very close friends. And Michael was very passionate about developing a field of what he called initially conservation biology that was both naturalistic and humanistic. You know, he had that, but Michael was one of Paul Ehrlich's students. In fact, Michael was Paul's first graduate student at Stanford. And he was probably the most important person to developing a culture of environmental awareness on this campus. So he's was a very important figure and one of our own here at UC Santa